Thank you, Miles, and thank you to the conveners of the series. It is a great honour to be here. I haven't been writing this book since 2003, I promise you that, although it's taken me a long time. I'm going to experiment with sitting down, I think.
Yeah.
So this paper is, it draws on material from that book that Miles mentioned, forthcoming, Temperance Lies, which is obviously the book on the left there. It's rather presumptuous of me to place it next to Brian Harrison's Drunken the Victorians, which published in 1971 remains, I suppose, the standard work on British temperance and the drink question. But in part, my book was written out of a dissatisfaction with the way that book has been, I think, read and used in more recent histories of temperance and drink in Britain. And I think there's a sort of persistent framing of the drink problem and the temperance movement, which is kind of something I want to push back against a little bit. Harrison was, as I'm sure some of you, many of you will know, interested in temperance as a political campaign, a campaign for a particular form of prohibition. If David Beckingham was here, I'd have to then qualify exactly what that form was. But if you're listening, David, you know, and I know what form of temperance that was. But it was one that was essentially, for him, a failure, and you could tell from the 1870s that the identification of the Liberal Party with this campaign for local prohibition was going to be a politically loaded, in fact disastrous thing for them to associate themselves with. So for Harrison, the final part of his book is called The End, and it's essentially about the 1870s and what would go on to be the signs of the failure of this campaign. And that, I think, has been a very sort of popular reading of temperance, that it was largely a political campaign. It had other characteristics, but was really defined in that way, and that it was already a failure by the 1870s. I think that's echoed by recent political histories of drink and the drink question, although writers like Anne-Marie McAllister, David Beckingham and Henry Yeomans have offered far more nuanced studies of temperance in the last 10 years or so. But I did want to engage with this idea of temperance as essentially a prohibitionist movement, but also the idea that temperance was a bourgeois initiative designed to pacify the class tensions that emerged out of the Hungry 40s, which is the first sort of full decade, perhaps, of temperance activity in Britain, but also that it was largely a religious and moral mission or crusade. And most of this book has come out of a rather different set of documents, which are, on the face of it, not very exciting. So this is really a book which is, in a sense, kind of a history of a set of businesses, which are often less exciting than things I've just been talking about, involved in temperance life assurance. And obviously, like me, I'm sure your heart beats faster when you hear those words, temperance life insurance. What could be more exciting than statistics and not drinking? Also death, because that's what really life assurance is about mortality. But reading these documents in a kind of particular kind of way, I think it's possible to make a case of them being much more significant and I hope interesting than that would suggest. So I'm trying to reframe temperance. Obviously, I'm not going to try and do that in this talk. I'm going to try to focus on this question of bad habits, but also think about good habits. But I do want to provide a little bit of context for those of you who may not know that much about the history of temperance. So in the 1820s and 1830s, the aristocratic and middle-class leaders of the first wave of temperance opposed the sale and consumption of spirits. So it was really just a moderationist movement that was more interested in spirits than in total abstinence. But they were soon challenged by teetotalers who, as their name suggests, were more interested in the total renunciation of alcoholic drink. So this second wave was more closely associated with working class, kind of a grassroots movement of sorts with some lower middle class leaders, had links to Chartism and the cooperative movement, as well as popular liberalism. It did have middle class supporters and leaders, but they were often nonconformists, particularly Quakers. And some of those Quakers and others have been active in the campaigns against the slave trade and slavery earlier, and they saw it as a continuation, really, of their mission, and that's why they called it the drink traffic, because they were picking up on the metaphors that had been arguably successful for the British side of the agitation over the trade in enslaved Africans. In the 1840s, the more established faiths, the Anglicans, but also Wesleyan Methodists, were actively hostile to temperance because they saw it as a challenge to their own authority. So this lower second wave, this working class wave of temperance was pushed out, excluded, in the language of some of those people, persecuted, by their betters, their social betters, across not just the Anglican faith, but also forms of nonconformity too. And so these tensions between different forms of temperance were visible within the movement itself. Teetotal society struggled with gentlemen and the Anglican clergy, who led the moderationists. They refused to agree with their betters in many of those cases. And this can be seen in the 1841 observation of the young Queen Victoria, who recorded in her diary that Lord Melbourne, who was bringing her up to speed on these things, had told her that it was, quote, a very singular thing, but that almost all these temperance people were radicals. While its character broadened over the 19th century, and part of the book is it's trying to trace some of the political histories which aren't written about, I think, in the kind of recent work that people have looked at. So it broadened, but temperance remained entangled in radical, socialist, feminist, pacifist, anti-imperial and abolitionist movements well into the 20th century. So picking up that alternative history of temperance, its political connections, is, I think, not something I've fully done in the book, but it's something that I think remains really important and interesting for me, anyway, maybe not for you. So recovering something of this history and acknowledging, as David Fahey pointed out in 1971, one of the things I think which wasn't taken up was this kind of sense of the multiplicity of temperance. He argued that it wasn't a single temperance movement, but rather, quote, a myriad of organisations, policies and prickly personalities, which is important for this. So that makes it more difficult to write temperance off as a failure because it had multiple aims. It wasn't simply invested in prohibition, and so the failure to achieve prohibition doesn't mean that temperance was itself a failure. Other historians have investigated some of these other organisations, but I found myself becoming interested in the temperance businesses that sprung up in Britain after 1840. They clearly had different goals to the religious movements, to the political movement, the alliance. They were guided by profits, obviously, they had a sense of the bottom line. And they weren't always guided by religious or even moral arguments. Sometimes business logics got in the way, and we might get a chance to talk about that at the end of the paper. A number of financial companies also seem to embody temperance principles of self-improvement and self-help. So they were not just talking about those things, they were actively, in theory anyway, providing people with the means to improve themselves. Some of those businesses, Temperance Life Assurance, also became unexpected allies in the temperance campaign to persuade doctors of the healthiness of abstinence. So that's one of the themes of the book, and I find myself in a history of science and medicine series, which is not where I expected to be with this book, but clearly some of what I'm doing is talking to histories of medicine at this point in time. So just on the left, this is a timeline of national temperance organisations from Harrison's book. I saved this image a long time ago and called it Splitters, a reference to Monty Python, because when people talk about the temperance movement, I want to query that singular, because these are all different organisations, largely political organisations. There are many other organisations and local organisations which you wouldn't fit on there. But the timeline of his book gives you a sense of the variety, which was often a variety of argument and disagreement that was going on at this moment in time. But in the middle, we have Robert Warner, who I think certainly thought himself as the hero of the story of Temperance Life Assurance. I'm not so sure about that. And I want to quickly turn to him to tell you how Temperance Life Assurance worked and how it had its origins. So in 1840, a young Quaker called Robert Warner sold a life assurance policy. He'd recently married and was expecting a young family to follow. He was prosperous. His family owned a foundry near the edge of the city of London. In the later retellings of the origin myth of Temperance Life Assurance, one firm that he consulted warned him that he'd have to pay a higher premium than other men of his age, as he was a total abstainer. Additions of this kind, like active service in the military, a pre-existing medical condition or pregnancy, so in theory women of any kind of childbearing age could be given an additional premium for that kind of reason, because of the risks of pregnancy and childbirth. Any of those additions were intended to cover an additional risk to the life of the applicant and to the firm's finances. So these were people they were trying to basically screen themselves against, either by putting them off or by charging them more money so that they didn't lose out if they had to pay them a claim early on. This kind of suspicion of temperance in Warner's case reflected medical suspicion of total abstinence. The influential German chemist Justus von Liebig had suggested that alcohol was a food. So it was taken for granted that you needed a certain amount of alcohol if your diet was insufficient in other ways. Spirits were commonly prescribed as medicine. Physicians like Robert J. Graves and Robert Bentley Todd developed popular systems for teaching doctors how to prescribe alcohol to treat fevers and tuberculosis from the early 1830s. So alcohol was both the medicine that people would be given. It was also used to carry drugs that were dried. You could have dried powders in ports and so on. But it was also seen as a food and therefore essential for life, particularly for labouring men, for porters, dockers, those sorts of people. As a consequence, life assurance companies, learning from this medical wisdom, treated abstainers as potential risks, especially where they might be reclaimed drunkards, as they referred to them, who had already damaged their health beyond repair. Warner clearly considered himself a better risk than a moderate drinker. He was not happy with this diagnosis, and he discussed this with friends and business contacts, some of whom were also members of the Society of Friends. He was quite well connected in this regard, so the result was a new insurance company which would only assure teetotalers, initially called the UK Total Abstinence Life Association. Warner and his friends, and this is part of the first part of the book, effectively took up existing and emerging temperance networks and converted them into life insurance networks. They found directors, men with respectable reputations and money to help them run the firm. They found local agents to sell policies and sympathetic doctors, although there weren't very many of those at first, to examine applicants. The first members of the society tended to be of very modest means, so it actually looks a lot more like a friendly society at this point. These are largely working class and some lower middle class customers. But because that meant that there wasn't a huge prosperous market here for them, the company struggled in its first few years. In 1847, fearing that the company would go bust otherwise, they decided to admit moderate drinkers. So they were still screening excessive drinkers, as other insurance companies were doing, but they were allowing in moderate drinkers as well. Changed its name to the UK Temperance and General Provident Institution to reflect the fact they were recruiting both temperance and general applicants. The firm prospered in the 50s and 60s, and by 1890 it was the 8th largest life assurance firm in Britain in premium income. By 1898 it was the 6th largest in terms of its accumulated funds. This is a bit like REF, you can pick all kinds of measures to say that you're the largest, but it was a significant firm. It was a major firm and a mutual firm, which meant that everything was owned by its members, and it was the largest mutual in Britain. The temperance section was still in operation in 1952, so it's quite possible some of the abstainers it assured were still alive in 1986 when the firm merged with Friends Provident, and Friends Provident was itself taken over by Aviva in 2015, which is one of the reasons why I can use these sources, because Aviva have the best archives of any insurance company that I've come across. So this is a story of a man reacting to this view, as someone later put it, that a teetotaler, it was a worse life than an ordinary, in other words, a moderate drinker life. So this decision to open doors to moderate drinkers had unintended consequences. They kept the records of the different kinds of sections separately, and they tracked the life expectancy, the longevity of people in the firms separately too. This meant that they could be compared with one another. And it soon became apparent that the abstainers in the first section lived longer on average than the moderate drinkers in the second section. So if you look at these exciting figures here, the vital statistics, this is from the 1870s, you can see that in most years there is an expected number of deaths, which means that from the kind of what actuaries think is the kind of regular life expectancy of a normal population, this many people should die. And if you compare that with the actual deaths, you see that, for example, in 1871, 72 people actually died in the temperance section when they were expecting perhaps 50 more than that. So you can see that the general section is much closer on the whole, and actually in the first 5 years exceeds the 1330 figure there, the number of expected deaths, whereas the temperance section have perhaps 2/3 of the number of expected deaths. So this was statistical proof of sorts. We can get into that in the questions if you're interested, that those who didn't drink lived longer than those who drank in a moderate way. The card on the right is something which is published. It was designed, it was quite small. It was designed so you could pop it into your friends, a letter to your friends, so that they would see the risks of their drinking when they. I'd love to see someone's face when this appeared in their post. But this is somebody experimenting with a graphical way of demonstrating the same kind of claim, and this is based on data from the UK Temperance and General Provident Institution, as you can see at the bottom there, with 100 being the amount of deaths you would expect, and the red being the drinkers and the blue being the non-drinkers. So this is starting to circulate as claims for the healthiness of abstinence, which was a new claim to be made at this point in time. There's another consequence of this. Because it's a mutual society, there are no shareholders to reward. Everybody receives a share of the profits every 5 years in this company's case. It soon became obvious that the bonuses that were being distributed to the abstainers were larger than those that were being given to the moderate drinkers. And this wasn't favouritism, but was simple maths. Abstainers lived longer. They lived to make more premium payments, so they were paying in more often than moderate drinkers did. And the firm didn't have to pay claims on abstainers as often as they would for moderate drinkers. More money coming in, fewer payments going out, so the money in the abstainers section grows faster than the funds in the general section. One actually later put it this way: those that don't drink don't die so fast. It was a neat marketing slogan. And abstainers therefore enjoyed a greater return on their policies. So their policies are still whatever they insured. They would get £100 when they died or when they reached 60 or 65, but they would also get this regular bonus on the way. So the £100 would soon become much more. Once the firm began marketing this point, it provided a powerful incentive to insure with the firm. Some claimed that it also provided an incentive to abstain. Here was proof not only that you would live longer, but you would actually make more money out of your policy if you gave up drink. But the firm's experience, which is its word for the data it collected on the life expectancy of its members, also became a persuasive argument for the temperance movement in general. Here it seemed was statistical proof of the health benefits of total abstinence. The firm's figures began to circulate, so they're presented at meetings of the British Association, amongst in its economics strand. You get newspaper arguments about the drink question. It turns up in popular science columns, wedged in between the discovery of a new kind of India rubber and other sort of, mineral and scientific claims to novelty. It becomes, in other words, a kind of standard way of making an argument about medicine and alcohol. Other temperance life assurance firms opened, seeking bits of the market that the UKT, as I'm now going to refer to them in future because it's a long name, hadn't got to. And mainstream life assurance companies began to reconsider their policies on both abstinence and moderate drinking. So the book is partly making a case for this shifting insurance practice and also in line with that, medical practice too. So one of the arguments of the book is that life assurance officers, and this is where I get to the geography, and these temperance firms in particular, represented an important site for the production of knowledge about the risks of drinking. Mainstream medical opinion lagged behind, but eventually caught up with these firms. And their figures, the firm's figures, were given qualified support by a government report in 1918, which acknowledged that these figures were likely absolutely accurate, but also acknowledged there were other things going on in the selection of lives who were in these companies that made it less valuable as a general statement about health and drinking. But it was effectively a kind of government backing of this argument. The success of temperance life assurance depended upon the successful setting up and maintenance of national and international networks connecting many people and sites. Of course, because this is the 21st century, objects, material things circulating, bits of paper in particular. The stability of these networks was constantly challenged, not least by the potential for fraud, where applicants turned out to have lied about their drinking. And so firms needed to pay attention to the habits of their policyholders in a variety of sites, from courts to doctors' consulting rooms. So this paper considers the attention to the habits, both the bad habits and the good habits, of life assurance applicants and policyholders. We begin with a court case, so we start with the bad. I think I can get you here on the strength of some drunken baronets, and then you might hang around for the dry statistics, dry in both senses. But we start with court cases, a court case concerned with hidden temperance. We then consider a very intemperate life who somehow managed to deceive his medical examiners. And then we go on to see how firms try to encourage good behaviour from both doctors and applicants. So the bad, first of all. This is the case of Denman versus Scottish Widows. So in 1886, the Scottish Widows Life Assurance Society received a claim for a £3,000 policy, which is a huge policy, on the life of a 40-year-old woman named Ada Haffenden, who had recently died. She was the wife of a general practitioner who had also recently died. I'm not going to go into this, but almost everyone in this case and several of the associated cases had their own scandals and court cases attached to them. It's just one of those things where you think you're never going to come out of the rabbit hole that you're being in the newspapers, so effectively. So Kensington and her recently deceased husband were living Ada and her husband had lived in Kensington, in a large house in Kensington. He had been a general practitioner. He recently died. A man, though not related to the family, named John Eustace Denman, who brought the case, he presented the claim to the company. Scottish widows were suspicious for a number of reasons that we'll talk about in a second, and refused to pay, noting that Ada had concealed her intemperance from them, as well as her rheumatic gout. So rheumatic gout was probably arthritis. It's difficult to say, obviously, but in the popular imagination, this was a form of gout, which was an affliction associated with drinking. So two forms of drinking appear to be bedeviling Ada Haffenden's life here, and possibly had caused her early death. But more importantly, actually, for this case, Scottish widows were doubtful about Denman's claim to be the beneficiary of Ada's policy. When they refused him, he took them to court. In the hearings, Denman, a surgeon-dentist, claimed to be a friend of Ada's, saying she'd signed the policy over to him, made him the beneficiary, in return for a loan he had made her of £3,000. Unfortunately, in cross-examination, he couldn't prove that he had given her £3,000 because he said it had been in cash. When asked where he'd got that much cash, he said he'd won it at the races. He was unable to provide receipts for any of that money. Scottish Widow's defence lawyer suggested there had been no such loan, and that Denman had in fact emptied her accounts while she was sick. There was no money in her account, even though her husband had been a very successful general practitioner. They accused him of seeking to fraudulently claim the policy after her death. The firm's lawyer told the jury that, quote, this was one of the most wicked frauds ever attempted on an insurance company. The trial was widely reported, and the jury heard details of Mrs. Haffenden's heavy drinking from her servants, her neighbours. It's amazing who will go out the woodwork to talk about these things, and even her brother-in-law. Scottish Widow's medical director, Sir James Risdon Bennett, had examined her when she applied for her policy. She claimed to be in good health and had not mentioned any of these conditions. Under cross-examination, Sir James agreed, quote, his opinion as to a temperance or intemperance might depend upon how the party had been got up before he saw him. In other words, that it's possible to present someone in such a way that they might appear to be sober when they were actually intemperate. So he's introducing a note of caution here. It was always difficult to be precise about someone's habits when you examine them. He was asked again if he thought that this might successfully deceive him, a very skilled medical practitioner and the head of effectively the medical bit of this life insurance company. And he said yes, especially so in the case of a lady, which provoked laughter in the court. And what I think the laughter was about the impropriety of a male doctor examining a woman applicant for life assurance. He wasn't accusing Mrs. Haffenden of deception, I think, but he was possibly giving her the benefit of the doubt for this reason. I'm going to turn to handbooks of insurance medicine in a moment to examine how people might have approached these kinds of cases, but here's one from a man called Edward Sevking. He warned the physician's gallantry must not mislead him when dyspeptic and anomalous nerve symptoms indicate alcoholism in the female. Unfortunately, the vice of secret dram drinking is met with in the best families. And quite a few eminent medical practitioners, these were all men at the big hospitals, and they wrote these handbooks. They said, I may have been misled by women who applied for life insurance. So it was kind of a recognized grey area where these things were doubtful. But most importantly, perhaps the case, if not for my book, Denman had no insurable interest in Ada's life. Insurable interest is the thing which allows you to claim the life insurance policy. You can't take out or benefit from a life insurance policy on someone that you have no insurable interest in. I could not take out a life insurance policy on Charles III's life, for example. I could find a betting shop that might take a bet, but that's a different thing to a life insurance policy. So if Denman had really lent her money in return for that policy, that would count as insurable interest and he would be able to claim it. But because there was no evidence for this, and he was talking of funny race winnings, the jury found for Scottish widows under the direction of the judge, and Denman's case was dismissed. Interesting though, because I'm talking about the grey areas here, the Standard newspaper took the opportunity in reporting the end of this case to write a piece on insurance fraud, saying that it was very easy for people to try to defraud life insurance companies. Denman promptly sued them for this, and he lost that case too. He's a man who loses a lot of cases. He seems to have been involved in several fraudulent schemes after that. This is one of the wormholes. In 1894, on the picture on the right, he was found guilty of running a sham orphanage in Worthing and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He's the kind of person who would now probably have a Netflix documentary series made about him. So he does 10 years inside. He's the one in the middle there with the mutton chops of the three accomplices that he has, and below that is the man from the NSPCC who busts the case wide open and is responsible for this judgment. So the Heffernan case is a good example of the kind of scandals insurance firms sometimes found themselves involved in. In a sense, this was inevitable, and in a sense, it's still inevitable in life insurance. There's a thing called information asymmetry, which is a lovely euphemism in life assurance, which means that applicants know more about their circumstances than the company do. They have all the cards, and the company is trying to work out what they've got. Also, the unwell are more likely to seek life assurance than the healthy, which is why social forms of life insurance are very useful in welfare states. Timothy Alborn, who is probably the authority, I think, on British life assurance, notes that these court cases were a bit of a risk for life insurance companies because, on the one hand, Scottish widows won this case. They could prove that they were tough on fraud and they'd won it and that they couldn't be fooled. But often there was so much kind of bad publicity which came out that some of the mud would stick to life insurance companies. And I think someone like Denman, it was worrying that he'd got close enough to this to be able to almost claim 3,000. So it's a kind of mixed messages. And remember also the reporting of that grey area over women's drinking. It's the kind of thing that probably firms did not want to advertise in the national and local press. But all the same, courts were essential sites for 19th century life assurance. As scandals and sudden closures in the 1840s, businesses go bust overnight, but also corruption created popular distrust of life assurance firms. The legal principle, I hope I pronounced this right, of uberrima fides, utmost good faith, is meant to guarantee that assurance firms and customers can trust one another. So everyone is meant to be honest and truthful, and if they're not, it can invalidate a claim or a policy. But Corey, Caliscan and Michel Calon have urged us to open the black box of trust to examine the devices that successfully hold markets together. So developing this line of thought, Luis Lobo Guerrero suggests that trusts emerge from networks. It's not the thing that causes networks to function, it's something that comes out of them. This is the processual moment that some of us are in. And he says, not a given, but an outcome of the insurance relationship. It is actively and continuously produced through the faithful interaction between client and insurer, and its effect is a reputation that can be considered as capital for future insurance transactions. Trust is not a singular external thing, in other words. Instead, Foucauldian orders of trust are produced locally within particular sets of relationships. Life assurance firms attempted to compel applicants to be truthful about their health. Applicants looked to regulators to force firms to tell the truth about their products, and both looked to other agents, particularly the courts, to produce binding, truthful outcomes in cases of disagreement. So there's a lot of nervousness here, but people are starting to bind themselves into these kinds of relationships to make it possible to conduct life assurance trustfully. The outcome of the Heffernan case is one of these local truths, and it shows the difficulty that firms faced in detecting intemperance when applicants first came to them. That kind of difficulty can cause further problems if you later end up in court. Scottish widows got away with this one. Several other companies would not be so lucky with another drinker, Sir Richard Mansell Mansell. He really is called Sir Richard Mansell Mansell, which people find it hard to believe. So here's our second example of bad habits. It's probably not possible to read, apologies. This is an example of the challenges firms faced when it came to dishonest drinkers. While he spent many years in court, this baronet managed to trick several companies into issuing him policies. Now, this is a storied family who traced their roots back to the 13th century John Mansell, favourite of Henry III. The baronetcy was established in the reign of James I, and Sir Richard Mansell, born in 1850, looked set to inherit nearly 1,000 acres of land in Wales and Surrey when he succeeded his father, Major Courtney Mansell, to the baronetcy. He established a life assurance policy with the National Life Assurance Company in 1885, largely on the strength of his policy with another assurance firm, the Eagle. So if you had one policy and it was trusted and believed to be genuine, you could then possibly use that to garner some trust, as we were hearing about a moment ago, for a second one. And that company gets taken over by a company that I was working on, so I found this in the report of the medical examiner. These things are very hard to find. Not entirely sure of the ethics of me looking at this now, but we can perhaps talk about that later. But so he has the successful policy that the Eagle have given him, and the National, when they give him this new policy, they let him through. But then in 1888, they come back to him, and the National's medical officer re-examines him, and he notes, you might not be able to read this, he shows sign of free alcoholic indulgence, bloated face, tremulous hands, dull in conversation. lower down, he should not have accepted him had we seen him at first. So if this medical officer had got to him, he would have refused him. The Eagle's medical officer had let him through. His name was Dr. Ogle, who had not been very perceptive in this case, hadn't spotted that one at all, so I'll stop with that. And Dr. Ogle had suggested, though, that Richard pay an extra sum, just as Warner had been told to do. In fact, he'd said that he should pay a premium of a man 10 years older than his actual age, which suggests that his health was so bad that he was being rated up 10 whole years. He was 35, but he was treated as if he was a man of 45. After his re-examining of Richard, the National's medical director was not sure that this would be enough to cover the cost of effectively an early payment, an early claim. He noted this amount will not cover the risk at present. He was right to be concerned because Richard would be dead within 4 years. He barely made it past 40. Richard's troubles had started decades before. When his father died in 1875, the will was disputed by his, I think, 7 children, who claimed that Richard's solicitor had persuaded the Major to change the will in Richard's favour. This dirty work had been done in the bar of a hotel in Portsmouth. It's all very low rent, this. The witnesses of the new will were the hotel's proprietor and a waiter. In the long and scandalous case that followed, the court heard that the Major had been unwell, unwashed, crazed, prone to climbing out of windows, weak and pliant, and constantly the worse for liquor. He had a particular taste of both morphia, so opium effectively, and whiskey mixed with marmalade. But I haven't tried it. It was claimed he had once dictated the course of his yacht, the Cambria, to the ship's Parrot. Richard did not come out of the case looking much better than his father, accused not only of interfering with the will, which was serious in itself, but with stealing and pawning his father's jewellery, forging his signature in order to withdraw money from his bank account. The court heard that Richard had been barred from getting his share of the will some years before his father's death because, quote, he was leading an unwholesome and unhealthy life. It would be some time before he was able to inherit the title and his estates. It seems likely that Richard's assurers had somehow missed this case when they first gave him his policy, but suspicions of this kind did surface in 1879 when another company, the London Life Assurance Company, accused him of lying on his proposal form and therefore obtaining his policy under false pretenses. He'd been asked, have you been declined by any other life insurance firms? And he had said no. He had also chosen his words quite carefully, but he didn't give a categorical answer to that. It turned out he'd been declined by 5 other firms who had seen through his deception. Companies were beginning to work together to exclude bad risks, like Richard, asking applicants to state whether they had sought and been rejected the policies with other firms. So in that case, the policy is terminated. Richard finally manages to get hold of his father's estates in 1883, immediately declares himself bankrupt because he has £50,000 worth of debts to cover, unimaginable amount of money, sells off land at Wimbledon and Carmarthen. Most of what we now know as Wimbledon is down to this man's bankruptcy proceedings. It's astonishing. Having divorced his first wife, he now married Ada Alice Lee, a musical singer and dancer who performed under her stage name as Lily Ernest, and she once acted as Vesta Tilley's stand-in. So she's quite a successful performer on the stage. An East End woman who managed, like the Gaiety Girls of legend, to land herself a lord in marriage. By the time of their marriage, Ada was earning £40 a week at the Trocadero, while Richard had once again begun insolvency hearings. He died just over a year later in a Brighton bungalow. 41, he'd spent much of his adult life in court. His scandalous reputation continued after his death, thanks to an American gossip columnist in US newspaper columns, who told his readers that Sir Richard had been a bankrupt and a drunkard, and a drunken spendthrift whose extravagance resulted in the loss of the ancestral home of the family, all while Ada was supporting him on the stage. So that's the bad habits done with. This is the person missed at the first stage, which is Sir Richard, and the case which was fixed in court, which was Ada Haffenden's. We turn now to good habits. So this is, at first, we're going to be talking about how firms tried to train medical examiners into good habits, and then we'll talk about how they trained their policyholders into good habits through life insurance policies. So the director of the UKT described his medical examiner's efforts to find these deceptive drinkers as a minute inquisitorial inquiry into the habits of these candidates. Firms had long been worried about excessive drinking, but between the 1840s, when the UKT appears, and the 1870s, they slowly began to accept that total abstinence could be healthy, and they also started to tighten up their definitions of excess. In 1884, the Prudential acknowledged, quote, the company had sustained considerable loss from the early deaths of publicans and those immediately connected with public house trade. And this prompted them to think seriously about how they dealt with this. They'd already been charging them an additional premium as people who worked in mines or carried gelignite through cities, something I hadn't realised was a thing, were being charged an additional premium, but these were publicans who might be charged a similar kind of rate for those extremely dangerous jobs. This growing suspicion of drinking can be traced in the handbooks written by for medical examiners. So assurance firms basically encouraged respectable physicians from the major London hospitals to write these books for provincial examiners. They could send them out, often free, as part of the condition of joining the firm. They also added a series of questions to their proposal forms. Early in the century, medical references are vague. So this is one from the Norwich Fire and Life in 1809. George Nichols was applying for a policy. His medical attendant, who was probably a friend, said, I never saw him intoxicated that I can recollect, but I've heard that he likes to drink when he can get it, which is but seldom, as he has a wife and a large family to maintain, which I pass as he would drink a lot more if he had the chance, but he's unable to at the moment. Later guides start to ask for detail. They ask for detail about the general mode of living. This is from Pollock and Chisholm's Medical Handbook. Whether in town or country, his opportunities for exercise, the hours of his meals. Francis de Havilland Hall asked the examiner to get a definite reply as to the amount of alcohol the applicant consumes in 24 hours, as well as the character of the drink, so the particular kind of drink and therefore its alcohol content, whether it was taken only at meal times or between meals, and the time at which the first drink of the day is taken. People were told that if someone came to the examination smelling a drink in the morning, that was probably a bad sign. Robert Hutchison and Harry Rainey's Guide to Clinical Methods, so this was written for all examiners, not simply for insurance examiners. They suggested the examiner asked the applicant to give a brief account of a typical day. So they were trying to work out a sort of more qualitative sense, I guess, of the rhythms of their life and their habits. Here's a form from much later, this is from 1929, incredibly detailed list of questions about habits, not just drinking, but you can see that by this point, forms are starting to really, well, they're asking the medical examiner to read this out, or they're asking the applicant to go through this and fill it in detail. In this one, this is for the medical examiner to ventriloquize. So there's some details there about these things and also other things being brought up. So this attention to habits created a rich, precise vocabulary of drinking practices and types, from the, quote, steady soaker, associated with the manual labour of butchers and porters, to the businessman who relied on bracing himself up by taking a glass of brandy and soda, middle-class moderate diners out, and virtuous dancing young ladies who would be surprised to discover how much they were drinking. There were early in the day drinkers, drinkers with meals, and the spree drinkers prone to the periodical debauch after months of sobriety. For these doctors, habit combined the places in which applicants worked and played, the rhythms of their days and nights, and the social settings in which they found themselves. And all these things could be proxies for excessive drinking. As a consequence of this, the consulting rooms of the firm's medical examiners, so these were scattered, these are people, your local representative of the firm who'd go and have a checkup from, they became significant spaces of diagnosis, as David Livingstone put it, and other geographers of health as well, historical geographers of health. And so we can add them to better study sites like hospitals, dispensaries, and workhouses. As Virginia Berridge pointed out in an important early article, the risks of opium consumption were first discussed in 2 trials in the 1830s, so long before it had acquired associations perhaps with the East. And this was following the death of the Earl of Mar, who was a prodigious taker of opium and had managed to keep that secret from his assurers. In other cases, early on, insurance firms looked to have worked out the etiology of tuberculosis long before Koch did. And insurance medicine had long been a significant source, therefore, of medical ideas and practices. It transformed the role of the general practitioner as well, because people were not in the habit before insurance medicine of going to their doctor when they were well. This was a new thing. They would go, they would ask to be checked out. There was a routine set of things that they would be asked and measurements taken. And this was a novel form of examination, which several historians have argued is the source of the clinical examination. So the clinical examination is structured by and driven by the need for medical checks. Similarly, the development of recording of blood pressure is down to life assurance checking applicants for hypertension. So again, this anticipates medical arguments about blood pressure. So these developments have profound consequences, not simply for the way that examinations were conducted, but for the nature of the medicine these local doctors practiced on behalf of assurance firms. And crucially, this was also a de-skilling of these highly competent professional practitioners. Firms wanted practitioners who knew what they were doing. They wanted men with good reputations, men still at this point. But they did not want them to put their skills to use in ways that varied from the firm's expectations. Directions passed on in these handbooks, written for examiners, and instructions from firms urged doctors to follow a standardized set of questions and tests. Medical referees became distant tools of the central office. Standardizing a referee's responses ensured that their results were comparable with other referees, allowing firms to iron out local variations in practice and belief in favor of a single, consistent approach. The chief medical officers of these companies effectively converted doctors' examination rooms into copies of their own consulting rooms at the head office. Highly trained doctors become simple recording devices plugged into wider networks. Paper forms transmit that information back to the centre of calculation where decisions are made. This reduced the importance of a local doctor's own opinions of the risks associated with alcohol, while disseminating an orthodoxy of medical practice within these networks. So it didn't matter whether a local doctor believed that drinking shortened life expectancy. They had to act as if they believed that. They had to follow the instructions if they were to remain employed by the firm and if the policy was to be worth writing out. They had been taught good habits of data collection, and if they did as they were told, everyone would prosper. And finally, we get to good habits. How long have I got? It's fine. Okay, right. So finally, good habits in ordinary temperance. So these are the ordinary applicants for temperance and the policyholders of these firms. So firms are also working to improve the habits of their policyholders. Insurance is commonly considered to be a form of governmentality because it encourages thrift. Jeremy Bentham suggested that liberalism needed to, quote, accustom men to submit to the yoke of foresight, to consider future risks and to guard against them. Insurance was the preeminent way of achieving this. Pat O'Malley describes it as a governing technology for instilling and institutionalizing thrift. Teetotalers were already accustomed to looking forward through taking the pledge. This is a promise to a future self and perhaps to your family, the pledge. Temperance assurance firms used similar terms to those employed by Bentham. It's not really very different, I think, to the way Bentham phrased this. So in Cardiff in 1870, James Mills, who worked for a life insurance company called The Sceptre, who had an important temperance business, he told his audience that, quote, men must be taught habits of economy, forethought, and self-reliance, adding that men must be taught to save before we can assure their lives. A similar tone could still be detected in Eagle Starr's prospectus from 1915, which described life assurance as, quote, an excellent means of educating men out of selfishness and training them to have due consideration for others. Life assurance could encourage this due consideration, and policies that grew in value because you were living longer and you had more chance to gain your bonuses might have a special attraction in this regard. Thomas David Lister explained in his Handbook for Medical Examiners that these policies have the advantage of tending to produce that desire for longevity, which may come from the certainty that the longer the proposer lives, the more his dependents will derive from his insurance. So in establishing habits of forethought, temperance, life assurance encourage people to become more risk averse in their desire for longevity. So the idea is that you're sitting there thinking, my family is going to do really well out of me, and then thinking, but I've just got to make it a little bit longer to the next bonus payment, and then it will be worth even more. So it's a sort of virtuous circle of self-conduct, I guess. The first appearance of these more moral arguments in the 1840s is not hugely surprising, given that questions were being asked in that decade about the principles and workings of the New Poor Law. The UKT's first physician, Robert Dundas Thompson, in 1841 suggested, quote, the heads of families may essentially contribute to the desirable end of dispensing in a great measure with the present obnoxious poor rates by teaching a practical lesson their servants, by which he meant persuading them to stop spending money on beer and investing it in a life insurance policy, which would later then mean that those householders didn't have to pay such expensive rates to cover the workhouse. So effectively trying to keep people out of the workhouse through persuading your servants anyway to change their habits. Thompson, who incidentally was the first president of the Meteorological Society, he was a Gradgrindian physician who spent years attempting to devise a more efficient, i.e. cheaper, workhouse diet. drawing on his research on cattle feeds, which he thought would be instrumental in helping him reduce the cost of workhouse feed. And the moral tone of his intervention is clear, but there's a wide range of different ways in which these companies and their employees approach the idea of improvement. And I think he's at one end of the spectrum. There are other more liberal and perhaps more progressive ways in which people were thought to be working on themselves through this kind of policy. It's clear, for example, that life assurance operated as a form of effective technology, offering the policyholder a sense of security as future disaster was now to some extent guarded against. This was the basic point of life assurance. More importantly, it's possible that temperance life assurance encouraged good habits precisely because it was so prosaic, so ordinary, so dare I say it, boring. Other histories of temperance emphasize the spectacular saloon smashing of American teetotalers, the political drama associated with liberal efforts to pass temperance legislation, or the morally charged tracts and sermons of gospel temperance. That's where all the drama is. But temperance life assurance involved prosaic practices and relations, paying of weekly, quarterly, or yearly premiums. How exciting. Some correspondence with the firm, usually at the start and end of the process, and attention to the reporting of annual meeting and regular bonus payments. The only thing that needed to be done, because you were a teetotaler, was you needed annual confirmation of abstinence from your temperance society. None of that would have seemed particularly exciting, or dare I say it, noticeable. So as a consequence of this, the reporting of the arguments that life assurance firms made on behalf of abstinence often described them as cool, or cold, dull, or prosaic, hard-headed, or unprejudiced. And here's some from the kind of turn of the century. Why do they do this? Because it pays. There's a business logic to this. There's not necessarily any moral argument. Why not do this? You'll live longer and you'll make more money out of it. Who would possibly argue against that? These are not fanatical agitators or partisan temperance organizations, but business companies governed exclusively by cool commercial prudence. Disappointing the undertakers is a great headline for this. The Manchester Guardian noting people being kept out of the business of the undertakers. And even better, the Pittsburgh Press making the Grim Reaper hold his hat and wait. So these are the sorts of arguments which are presented as matters of fact, simple assertions, because they appeared to be absolutely verifiable and true. People did live longer and they received greater wealth for it. But that was just something which happened because of perhaps the laws of mortality, which life assurance companies were trying to uncover at that time, a particular kind of sense that was a natural life to someone's natural length to someone's life, but also the laws of the market, that these were simple things that businesses could do and you would benefit as a result. So in the courts, doctors, consulting rooms and insurance offices, ideas of the risks associated with drinking were made and remade as firms sought to detect bad habits and train doctors and policyholders to adopt good ones. Everyone seemed to prosper as a result, everyone except the fraudulent applicants who were caught in fine, that is. The book concludes by suggesting that we see temperance life assurance as what Michel Calon called a problematization of drinking. The UKT and other temperance life assurance firms presented themselves as the solution to a series of problems other actors were wrestling with. Temperance life assurance allowed some things to happen. It allowed a statistical comparison of the longevity of drinkers and abstainers, for example. And that meant that different ideas about the medicalization of alcohol could be compared. Rival ideas about how alcohol worked and what could be done about it could be tested against these statistical figures. It encouraged abstainers to remain teetotal and to look to the future. It provided work for agents and additional income for doctors struggling to survive in an overcrowded medical market. So it solved all of those problems to many people's satisfaction. As a consequence, these firms were extraordinarily productive sites, generating security, hope, incomes, and capital for investment, as well as new forms of knowledge about drinking. Most importantly, perhaps, they offered a model for managing drinking by rewarding abstainers, tolerating moderate drinkers, and refusing the intemperate. Over the course of the 20th century, those attitudes, which had once been so unusual that Robert Warner had to start his own company to assure teetotalers, those attitudes became entirely unremarkable. There's very little, I think, that we would challenge, most people would challenge, in that sense of what the risks of drinking are. So I think in that sense, this aspect of temperance, unlike perhaps its argument to prohibition, was entirely successful. Thank you.